My name is Isabelle McConville, and I am a bookseller here at Barnes& Noble. And today I am so excited to speak with Maggie Stiefvater, author of The Raven Cycle, the Shiver Shit trilogy, dozens of other incredible YA books, and most recently, her adult debut, The Listeners. Maggie, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
So I love this book. I really, really love this book. It has a little bit of everything in it. There's a little bit of magic. There's a little bit of romance. It's a great historical look at a very fraught time in our country. Can you please, in your own words, set up the story of your new novel for us?
The Listeners starts right after Pearl Harbor when America is getting into World War II, and it looks at a West Virginia hotel that is tapped by the State Department to take on hundreds of Axis diplomats. And I was really interested in following the lives of the hotel manager and her staff as they grappled with this idea of what it meant to provide luxury for the enemy until they were able to be sent back to their own countries.
And if you could pinpoint a moment where the idea for this book really sparked for you, and if you could think about where this book just really started, do you think you could do that?
I absolutely can. I can remember, I wish I could recall the precise title of the book I was reading at the time, but I knew what I was doing. I was researching historical hotels because I knew that my next project was going to be a hotel book. And this was long before COVID. And I know entirely why that past me wanted to do a hotel book. I've written many other novels. I was always on the road for tour. I've been in a lot of hotels. I have a lot of feelings about hotels. And it seemed like a natural fit. But beyond that, I remember that I was staying in a very singular hotel in London, the Gore. And it's a tiny hotel. It's like a shoebox, but also it's like a cross section of a hotel. Like what do you call that? You slice the moment and you can see it, a diorama. Every single floor looked different because it's one of those historical hotels. And when I was staying there, it was as if every single guest who was there had been placed there as a capital letter profession. So I was the author, but there was a doctor and an explorer and a journalist. And every single time you climbed the stairs to your room, you could run into one of these in the pub or in the elevator or wherever you might be and have this very singular conversation about people who were at the top of their game, but we were all playing different games. And we would have never met each other in any other way. And so that was the moment when I really thought, okay, this is what I really find interesting about hotels. This idea of forced proximity, people who wouldn't necessarily spend that much time together. And so this percolated for years. I was in the middle of another series at the time. And I was just reading up. I was a history major, so I love just reading up about history anyway. And I remember there was a throwaway line. This is where I wish that I remembered what the name of this book was. It's just a throwaway line that talked about the Appalachian hotels that were asked to take on Nazis during World War II. And I thought, Nazis? Those are my mountains. Those are my hotels. How do I not know about this? So that was the beginning.
Yeah, that it doesn't surprise me that writing or the idea to write this book came from staying in a hotel. There's something so intriguing about hotels, just like you were saying. It's like a home away from home, but they can be a really happy place, a really sad place. I think the same thing about airports sometimes in airplanes.
They're very liminal spaces. And
Yes.
I love working with metaphor. So using something like magic location to talk about a small feeling, but on this huge scale. And so this idea of a hotel being a liminal space, the beginning of war is a very liminal space. These diplomats were being taken out of their current existence as diplomats and being held in this liminal space. They themselves were almost liminal citizens because even though they were born in the countries that they represented, they spent most of their adulthoods all over the world. So they weren't really, for instance, a German diplomat. How German were they really by the time they ended up getting stuck inside this hotel? So to tell the story of a woman who was in a liminal position in her life and to be able to do just metaphor upon metaphor upon metaphor felt very satisfying.
Absolutely. And just like you were saying, this liminal period of history as well, this book takes place about a month after Pearl Harbor. And so what I think is really interesting too is seeing especially in that very specific time period. It's the very beginning of the war. The country had just gone through this massive attack, and I'm so interested in how the people react to that and what happens to people in these times of uncertainty. And like you said, putting them in this pressure cooker of a hotel makes for a really interesting book.
It was really interesting to do the research for what hotels were doing at the time because there was such a huge amount of disbelief at the beginning. I remember reading that when the original broadcast came out for Pearl Harbor, a lot of people thought it was just another Wells sci-fi podcast because
Right.
the War of the Worlds had just come out. And so that was a long running radio podcast. I can't believe I said that. It was such a 2025 a radio broadcast. Right. Yeah. So it was so interesting to hear people think that it could never happen to the US. We were so free from being touched. And then it took so long for that to trickle down for people to understand. So you could see in the way that people reacted how much hardship they had actually had in their life. People who had already experienced hardship believed that hardship could come again, but people who had lived fairly easy lives took a very long time for them to believe that it was going to happen. So trying to see how that would actually influence the hotels and when rationing began, it was fascinating to dive first into the history, but also to talk to, for instance, the Greenbrier Hotel's historian. And even he didn't know if the Greenbrier had been subject to rationing. And I thought, okay, that's fine for a history book to not know if there's rationing. But when June, the manager, is walking down the hall and she's thinking about what she has to do for the day, I need to know what she's thinking about. So the kind of research that you have to do for a novel versus just reading everything about the situation, it's just so different.
And that really explains a lot about June, too, I think, because she is kind of both of these types of people that you've explained, where she's experienced hardship and she's also experienced a life of a certain kind of luxury. And so it's really interesting to see how she reacts to her environment and this sort of disbelief that she's in whether she can be touched by this war or whether she has already been touched by this war and may not know it yet. Can you talk to me a little bit about creating her character and really digging into who she is and finding her voice?
Yes. So when I first started writing this book, like I said, it was a hotel book. But that's just the setting. It's the excuse for a story. None of us read a book just for a fantastic moment in history to learn something. If we did that, we would just read the nonfiction. What we want is that human story. So as I was kicking around what this book was going to be really about, I thought, do you know what I want to do? I want to talk about what happens when people are collected. I remember growing up that our family, my father is very charismatic, and we're a very unusual family. He is an emergency room doctor, and I was a Navy brat. So we moved around all over, and at every single location, we would get these collections of situational friends that my father would have come over, and they would sit around the dining room table. And I would just think, what a cool life this is, what cool people these are to be surrounded with. And then we would move, or just the cycle of time would go by and there would be a different group of people. And as an adult looking back, I was thinking, oh, so I always thought that this was a very conscious ebb and flow and that this is just people going in and out. But once you're an adult, you start thinking, I wonder how many of those people would have preferred to stay at that dining room table and the situation was different for them. I don't know, because my lens was so narrow as a child. I was very much like a Hannelore, but still I was fascinated because once I started thinking about that, I could see it everywhere, though, that this is a dynamic that happens a lot, not just in families, but in friendships, that inequality where one person interprets a situation very differently than someone else.
Yeah.
So I very much liked this idea of June coming from nothing, being a very peculiar but interesting and charismatic person, and being collected by this family, the Guilfoyles, who are struck by how quick a study she is. And so she gets absorbed into this family and they just promote her and promote her and promote her. And her life obviously has changed entirely, but they have a very different understanding of what the relationship was between them. They loved her, but she thought she was going to be a Guilfoyle, and that was never going to be on the table. So I really wanted to look at that and see if I could tell that story in a way that would make us not judge June for not seeing it.
Yeah.
And also
Absolutely.
to not judge the Guilfoyles in their entirety for not understanding what they were promising June, according to her. Of course, Edgar Guilfoyle, the heir that she had her fling with, you can judge him all you like, but
and I do.
But the rest of that was the chorus. I just thought this feels like a very universal thing. I feel like everyone has either been the person who has been collected or who has inadvertently collected.
Yes, that's such a great point. And now I'm wondering, who am I in that scenario? And I know exactly who I am in that scenario, but we don't need to talk about that. Also, something that really jumps out at me about June is that when we first meet her, she's got this very intricate morning routine. She drinks 2 glasses of Sweetwater every morning, dresses in a very similar, if not identical fashion every single day. Her 3 dachshunds follow her, and we will get to the dachshunds everywhere she goes. What did you want this very intricate morning routine to convey to the audience? Why was that how you wanted to introduce her to us?
I love this question. When I was writing June, one of the things that I really wanted to convey was effectiveness. I don't know if you've been watching The Pit.
I haven't, but I'm one of the only people who hasn't at this point.
Should be watching The Pit. Okay, so obviously, as the daughter of an emergency room doctor, I'm biased. However, I did see someone say something about The Pit where they said, well, it's just competency porn. And I remember thinking, oh, but it is. There's something really appealing about seeing someone who is in complete control of their job in the world. Even before there's any, as a reader, something is going to come in to disrupt that world. But until that moment, just to see them do the dance is very appealing. But it felt very important to me to not just tell the reader that, but to demonstrate it and to demonstrate it truthfully. Because I do think the older I get as a reader, the less patience I have for nonsense in fiction. I don't mean fantasy and invention. I mean that when I read something, I think, that's not how that happens. That's not how people do that. It just feels, you're guessing. So it felt like I wanted June to be someone where you looked at her and thought, oh, I understand how she got to where she is. So some of this was coming from interviews with other hoteliers. I would say, how did you win your staff? Because they said you can't just be put into that position. You have to prove yourself. And part of it was drawing on my experience of teaching and leading students right after COVID hit in 2021, when we first were starting to wander out. I locked hundreds of aspiring writers into a castle in Scotland and repeated that every single summer. And those were those students that I was teaching with hundreds of one-on-one Zoom calls from September to February. So I was thinking about what that looked like, why they trusted me to lead them, because I wasn't teaching them writing. I was teaching them how to, we did talk about writing, but I think the most lasting lessons that they got were, how do they become the people who can believe in their own creativity and create productive routines for themselves and be bigger than they thought that they were at the beginning? And so why did they believe me? Part of that was they see you living a productive life. And then part of it is about this lack of judgment when you meet them where they're at. And the last part of it is, and this is the part that the Avalon really, really drew from, was taking them into that liminal space. There's something that's very crucial about starting that whole multi-year process, about putting them into a castle where you can't think about the laundry or your family, or, time stops having meaning there. And you don't even have any of your friends around there. You have all strangers all around you. And you're looking at a novelist who's just told you, I'm so excited you've been working on this novel for 10 years. You're throwing it out. We're not looking at that. It's starting, you're a new thing here. This is the womb. And that was so important, to be able to start to imagine yourself as anything. And so the Avalon very much was that. So this morning routine of June stepping into it, to me, that is a truthful portrait of how busy people get lots of things done, where they're very ritualized. They know that they cross these things off the list. They're out of the way. And then when havoc is wreaked throughout the day, because it always will be, you've bookended it with the most important part. So that's done.
Absolutely. I love the way you said that you wanted to demonstrate more than just tell the reader how she is as a character. I really love that. And that also makes me think about how we kind of know her, or no, we know June as two different characters almost. We know her as June and we know her as Haas, the way that the rest of her staff refers to her. And I think we get to know Haas first before we get to know June, but correct me if I'm wrong. That's just my opinion on that. But I wonder what it was that you wanted to do with having her almost have these two different personas. And you touched on this a little bit because I think that that's something that a lot of us do, right? I am one way at work, I'm one way with my parents, I'm one way with my partner, I'm one way with my friends. I wonder how you wanted to convey that intricate part of humanity in the book through June.
One of the things I wanted to do with this novel was to not tell the reader how to feel about each of these different stages of life. I didn't want you to come through and say, wow, June was wasting her life as this hotel manager and she needs to be something else. I didn't want it to feel obvious because when you're living that life, if there's a good path in front of you that you could take, it does not feel obvious to you. Life just doesn't work that way. And again, I wanted the reader to be soft towards June, but also to be soft towards themselves, to be able to look in the mirror and think, oh, right, what else could I possibly be thinking about? A different path that I could be taking. And so I think that it's not a bad thing to have an external self. It's quite protective. I also am a big fan of boundaries with friends. There's layers of knowing you, right? I'll know you this amount, but if I met you again, I'd know you a different amount. And then who knows how many different layers you have to peel away the onion to get to what you think of as your true self. But the part that fascinates me the most is that you said we meet June as Haas. I think that she's also meeting herself as Haas. She has forgotten what June is. And that is what the entire process of this book is rediscovering. Now that she's used Haas as a way to create a spine for herself, an exoskeleton where she can move through the world, because we see as a child, she's not good at moving through the world. She's created this not artificial, but extremely exaggerated version of herself to move through the world. And she wants to know now, can she take that armor off? And how much of that armor can you take off? And what's underneath?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And we also have Special Agent Tucker Rye Minnick, assigned to interview and monitor the Axis diplomats at the Avalon, who develops his own relationship with June. I'm not going to spoil it. Can you tell me a bit about how you approached his character? And he's such an interesting character. I mean, how did you approach writing a special agent?
When I was talking to the historian of the Greenbrier, and I told him, he said, well, this sounds cool. You're creating your own hotel in this time period. Who's going to be the main character? And I said, well, obviously the hotel manager. He said, yes, right, because they will have a front row seat. And he said, is that it? And I said, no, I'm also going to do an FBI agent. And he said, no, please don't do that. The FBI was so boring. I remember this. I mean, it was 3 years ago I had this interview, but I remember it so clearly. But he wasn't wrong. There's so much documentation about these hotel internments. And the FBI memos are, they're like watching paint dry. They can take anything and turn it into the most tedious memo. There's just boxes and boxes of documentation. And it's just lists and lists and lists. I thought that I dove into FBI memoirs instead. So not what they left behind, which to me, that's the Haas of an FBI agent, right? I wanted to know the truth. So what did it feel like? And what was really interesting to me is that this was another really liminal space for the Bureau. It started the war with just 600 agents, and the FBI had been founded just a couple of decades before to combat local corruption. They were supposed to be something that could come in from the outside, and they couldn't be intimidated because it wasn't their fight. And so they started out as this thing where it was such an honor and a privilege to be a bureau agent. They all were college educated. Most of them were lawyers or accountants or former sheriffs. I mean, they were just very impressive people who gave up a lot to become part of the bureau. And with just 600 of them, it was entirely possible that Hoover would know every single one of them by name. So what did it mean to be a bureau at the beginning of the war? By the end of the war, remember, 600 at the beginning, at the end was 11,000.
Wow.
because Hoover was working his political magic to create a different role for the FBI, and they were becoming increasingly involved in surveilling the average American citizen instead, knowing everything. So it just felt like the more I looked at this, the more I thought, oh, Tucker could be such an interesting counterpoint to June. He's also always at the edge. Is he going to shift and continue to be part of this bureau? Or this is his entire life, and he's, no spoilers, but he's done a lot to get to this place. So what is he going to do? And again, to have the reader not think, oh, the obvious choices that he needs to do this, and then to have June be the head of a collective, and then to have him be part of a collective was very interesting to me.
Oh, yeah. They're so interesting to me, especially the dynamic specifically between Tucker and June. I think that they're more alike than they think. They both have trained themselves to anticipate what a person is either going to need or do, right? And so I think that they both study people in a very similar way, and it makes for a very interesting dynamic.
I love that you said that, because one of my favorite scenes in the entire novel is when she's making paper airplanes with one of the Germans, and Tucker interrupts, and they have very different ideas of how that situation should be handled.
Yes. Absolutely. And another one of my favorite parts of the book was when at one point Tucker tells June to be June and not Haas. And I think that that is one of the rare opportunities that June has to experience luxury herself, right?
I love that you said that, because when I interviewed these hoteliers, I read a bunch of luxury hotel stuff from the past, and then I was patching the holes with stuff from the future. And they all agreed on one thing, which is that the central tenet of luxury is your identity, your name. And so I love that. Yes, I absolutely think that that is, June never gets to experience luxury. It's not being pampered, but to be truly seen and known as an individual.
That's luxury. And so I actually want to dive a little bit deeper into this idea of luxury. It really runs throughout the entire book, what it means, what it costs, and to whom. You say in the book that luxury is nimble. The business of luxury is the first thing on June's mind when she wakes up and the last thing on her mind when she goes to bed. It really is the center point of this book, I think. Can you tell me what interests you about this idea of luxury and what really brought you to write about it?
When I first started writing this book, I was sure that I was going to debunk luxury, actually. I was raised solidly, upper middle class, and we were not a luxury hotel sort of family. We're not a luxury in general sort of family. There's no country clubs in our future. I just thought, this is going to be nonsense. June is going to have been absorbed by this family, and it's going to be all excess and opulence, and we're going to watch it turn over from this arduous past of the Depression, and now we're into the new America, and luxury is dead. It's fine. Good. Great. Perfect. Let's burn that hotel to the ground. And the further I dove into this concept of luxury, the more I realized I was doing something which I had June kind of noodle on as well. I was conflating luxury and wealth. And luxury and service can be cousins, but they aren't the same thing. So this idea of being motivated by hundreds of staff members and they're all doing exactly what you want, that's not actually luxury by default. It's just service. And this is what they have back home. So the wealthy can have everything at their beck and call. So why would they bother to pick up things to come to someplace else? And this idea that luxury instead is a knowing service instead. What makes it feel luxurious is that it is a game that everyone involved has actually agreed to play. And because they're operating at the top of their game of providing luxury, you don't feel the same way about the people who are giving it to you, because you understand that you're more alike than you are apart. They are doing their best to be the best as well. So once I started to see this angle of it, it was easier to see the nuances that separated luxury from wealth. One of the major parts of it, again, is just being known. And another part is surprise. So if you say, next time I come, please make sure my slippers are on this side of the bed, that's fine. But if you come to the hotel room and you see that the staff has remembered that you always move the end table a little closer and it's already moved, That's luxury instead. So it's that anticipation that comes from the action rather than the action itself. The intention is absolutely everything in luxury. And I thought, oh, I think we could do with a lot more luxury, actually. And it really put a fine point on my discomfort with staying in hotels that were labeled as luxury hotels, as opposed to the sense of what I was reading about these grand luxury hotels in the past, which is I don't actually care about my thread count on my sheets, but I do care that when I go out, they remember that I'm going off to a book event and they recommend another book event. That is actually that interplay of luxury being seen as an individual. And I thought, oh, I am changing the thesis of this book entirely.
That's so interesting. And I'm so glad you did too, because I never thought about luxury in this way before, until I got to this book. It really made me just re-examine what I thought I knew about luxury and what it really means. So I'm really glad that you did that. Something else that really grabbed me in the beginning of the book was the decision to still throw a party at the Avalon for the guests, right? Again, this is right after Pearl Harbor. I think you even said you write that there was a decision made that the party must still go on. And then even though these guests are ousted because the Axis diplomats come, there's also a party thrown for them later on. Can you tell me a bit about writing those scenes and what you really wanted to convey with the party must go on?
It was very interesting to watch how people were setting intentions for what they wanted to be during the war. And not just people, but entire countries. So to read war memoirs that were from the UK at the time, to read about what those hotels did, even before they were asked to ration, the English hotels were already thinking about scarcity and this culture of austerity and being part of a bigger collective. But that's not really part of the American pedigree. We've always been fake it until you make it. And it was really interesting to look back and see this played out on a cultural scale again and again, this sense of who are we going to be? June has a part where she remembers how she was lauded for bringing the hotel through the Depression. And one of the things that she did was make sure that the hotel presented itself as a place where problems didn't exist, even in the Depression. This sense that you came there and it was aspirational, that this might not be what reality is, but this is what you want reality to look like. And just playing so hard that eventually the rest of the world will catch up. Especially at a hotel like the Avalon. These hotels, they always held tastemakers. These were the people who were in society pages that the rest of America was looking to follow. And so the attitude that they would take towards life is what it would be adopted again and again and again. So this idea of holding a party, they really did just continue holding parties, not just because at first they didn't believe it, but also because this is what it meant to be American. This sense of indulgence is tied inextricably to hope, because it seems like nonsense to say, how are you throwing a party in the middle of this? There are people out there starving. And instead, if you think about what they were actually doing, when you read about what they were actually thinking, this sense that this is what we want the world to return to again. And we have to remember why it's worth doing it. So this sense of imposing luxury on disaster was a very American way of looking at the war. When I was reading about the Japanese being interned in the hotels, there were multiple stories throughout all of the half dozen hotels where they specifically asked the hoteliers to stop providing them services because they thought it was unpatriotic. That even though there would be no way that anyone in Japan would ever know what they were eating, they said they were having too large of portions, or that there shouldn't be music or entertainment. It was inappropriate. They would go out in the lawn and do calisthenics because that was what it meant to be patriotic. And I would argue that in many ways that to the Americans, the spirit of continuing to create art and throw parties, that was their version of keeping the chin up and being patriotic.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And it's really interesting too, because it almost sounds like this idea, like you said, of throwing the party because that is what we aspire the world to look like again, right? It reminds me of the relationship that June has with the Sweetwater, right? Where you give and you take. You give good to the Sweetwater and it gives good back. You give ill, it gives ill back. Can you tell me a little bit about creating this Sweetwater and really establishing that or the boundaries around it and just how you came up with it?
When I started thinking about a speculative element to this novel, I already knew that I wanted it to be far more subtle than in my previous works. I'm quite known for having magic in my works, but I knew that I wanted this book to be appealing even if you didn't read fantasy. And I really did not want it to feel like genre fantasy, where the magic has definite rules and you need to know them in order to understand what's going on. So I wanted to operate at that level of myth and metaphor, that idea that you are taking a truth that is happening inside the book already and you're just amplifying it into something external. So I already liked this idea that if June loses control of her staff with this detention, it's all over. They are the ones who are holding the line. She's telling them, I know this is a strange situation to be feeding these people the best of the best while you're sending off sons to Pearl Harbor, but I want you to treat them well because that is what we do. This is what we do as Americans. This is what we do as a luxury hotel. Like, don't let them take your identity away just because of who they are. So that's how she guides them. But she's far outnumbered by them. And she is the mind, but they are her appendages. They are her fingers and toes doing her work. So if she loses control of them, then the entire thing is over, no matter how she feels about it. So I wanted the Sweetwater to be able to echo that as well, to have this sense that there's something beneath the hotel that she also needs to keep a very careful eye on, and also the sense that it's looking very closely to her. Like a child, they always say that babies, when they're upset, it's often because you're upset when you're carrying them because they're little mirrors. They can pick up on this. Dogs are the same way, right? And I feel like that's what I wanted out of the water was it could pick up on June's moods even before June can pick up on them. So she's learned to become extremely schooled. And again, it's just a heightened metaphor for the ways that she's trained herself to be in public.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And going back to what you said too about her having to keep control of her staff while she's asking them to do something that they may not necessarily want to do or believe is right to do. That makes me think about at one point, Tucker says his priorities as an agent are not always the same as his priorities as an individual. And we see this as a common thread throughout the book. I think June compromises her own morals to keep the hotel running smoothly. The journalist, Johnny Hosokawa, says that he's always wanted to write and he's always been Japanese. So he would just write what they told him to write, which ended up being nationalist propaganda. It's not necessarily what he believes, but again, it's this idea of compromising identity or morals with your workplace or with what you're meant to do, right? If you could tell me a little bit about that and what you wanted to convey with those themes throughout the book.
I think I think it's a truth of life. I think this goes back to that Haas June divide, where June has her essential beliefs of who she is, what her priorities are, where if she's not affecting anyone else, if she's not leading a collective or part of a collective, she has the luxury of believing and doing these things. But as Haas, it gets constrained by the requirements of whatever she has been slotted into, chosen to do. And Tucker is the same way. Left to his own devices, he might handle a situation in one particular way. I'm thinking of Sebastian, the situation with the waiter, where he has divided loyalties. The Bureau asks for one thing, his own personal opinion is another. But I think that what I wanted to really look at is how that collective can damage that sense of belief. Tucker gets to have this question of, if I want this thing and the Bureau says this thing, unlike June, who has that sense of, this is the thing I want, this is the thing that I can't have. Tucker says, this is the thing that I want, this is the thing that the Bureau wants. I might be wrong because the Bureau is always right.
Right.
Have that sense of, if the power of that collective is so persuasive, are you erasing people's individuality and their decisions for making their own prioritization for it? It reminds me a little bit of, I remember years ago when Twitter, this tells you how long ago it was, Twitter and Instagram were really coming of age. And my webmaster said, Maggie, make sure that you always have a blog of your own. Your own content should be on your blog because otherwise you will be changing your lens and becoming Twitter shaped or Instagram shaped or fill in the blank. And I've never gotten that because it is true where you don't think that you are sacrificing anything to go and say, oh, this is just going to be a 260 character version of myself. But you weren't going to do it in 260 characters. So that means you did change something for it. And I feel like I wanted to look at that again and again, or again, not that sense of right and wrong, but that thoughtfulness and intentionality about it.
Yeah.
Say, okay, shades of gray, how gray can we get here?
Oh, I love that. How great can we get here? That really is so true for this book. That's one of the things that really grabbed me throughout was just thinking about, what it means to compromise in that way and how that relates to luxury. So that was one of my favorite parts of the book for sure. I also know that you've said when you approached this book, you asked yourself a question. What do you call the genre that approaches fantastical elements with awe instead of terror? Can you tell me a little bit about the answer that you came to for that question?
I used to think I would never write a book without magic in it because growing up, there were so many books with magic in them that I adored. I grew up reading, like many readers, the Chronicles of Narnia or The Wrinkle in Time, A Wrinkle in Time. And I remember thinking, oh, what I love about these books is the magic. And then came of age, writing books in young adult. It's very punny. And I continued to put magic in there, but I had this increasing sense that I wasn't actually using magic like fantasy. And I started thinking, oh no, this is the level of, again, myth and metaphor, where the magic is taking something which is happening in the real world and making it bigger, making it louder for the cheap seats. I remember that when I was a history major, I was reading a story. It was in a collection of Welsh stories. And there was a story about a king, and the ballad said that he was larger than life and that he was like a giant. He couldn't fit in any house. And that at one point they were in a battle with the Irish and they traveled across a river, the Irish did, and the Welsh said, "What are we going to do?" And the king, who was larger than life, lay down across the river and they rode their horses over the back and they defeated the Irish. And I remember thinking, this is how I like to use magic, because that is the level of myth where it's taking a true thing and making it truer. He was larger than life. He probably was a huge personality, and they really couldn't defeat the Irish without him. Did he make himself a bridge? Not literally, but was he the one that found a way to get them to the other side of the river? Yes, definitely. So I like this idea of preserving those emotional moments in amber so you could remove all of the specifics and people would be able to feel that resonance. But when I looked at other genres that were doing this, I was thinking, gosh, in the adult world, magic doesn't really get used this way. It gets used in fantasy where it's magical rules, but not like Chronicles of Narnia, even though it seems quite magical. When you look at that in Wrinkle in Time, they're operating on that level of myth and metaphor where the actual stakes are very much real world stakes. And I thought, gosh, I want more books like this. And it all came to a head when I was meeting Will Patton, my audiobook narrator for The Raven Cycle. He had just finished reading the last book. It was very bittersweet. He said, "I think I've read 1,000,000 of your words into a microphone," which is pretty amazing. And he only reads a couple of authors. He reads Stephen King and Charles Bukowski and me, and basically what he reads. And he said that he went to the bookstore trying to find other books that were like my books. And I said, how'd that work out? And he goes, hell no. And he was saying that Stephen King and I use magic in a similar proportion inside our stories. But he said, it's like when magical things go wrong and are a warning, that's where you get into horror. But you use magic so it's where things go well or they change you in a positive way. And so he said, that's like wonder. And I said, stop the press. That's the genre I want. Can I write in wonder? That's what I want right there. So how can you write a novel that's about Nazis, that's about wonder? And I would say you have to have the Nazis. You can't shy away from the horrible things in life, or it feels like a fable instead. It's too pat. You have to actually show how the worst possible things could happen. And there still is wonder alongside it for it to feel like that sense of contrast, to actually feel magical in a interpersonal way.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think that this is ultimately a hopeful book. And all comes back to the wonder aspect of it. Absolutely. I have to ask you about the Dachshunds. They were one of the best little parts of the book. I need to know about the dachshunds in the book. And I also have to mention, you're doing a series on social media right now where you are drawing a dachshund every day until the book comes out. First, how are you doing that? That's a lot of dachshunds. You've still got a ways to go. I'm patiently waiting for number 64 today. So first, can you tell me about the dachshunds in the book, and then also about this challenge that you set for yourself?
Yes, dachshunds. I never thought I would be saying the word dachshund so much in my life. I have 7 dogs. None of them are dachshunds, in case you're wondering. Not even a small amount of them are dachshunds. I mean, it's just,
Oh my gosh.
yeah. So when I feel like the dachshunds encapsulates in a nutshell, though, so much of the components in this book, though, where it started out as a historical anecdote. I was reading a hotel memoir, and the hotelier in the memoir, this was from the 30s, I think, might have been the 20s, probably the 20s. He was talking about how guests had left behind a dog because it reminded him of the mistress he had had at the hotel, and he didn't want it anymore. And so he had ended up with this dog. He didn't know what to do with it. And I thought, gosh, I would like to give June a dachshund. And I thought, but June can handle more than one dachshund. June is very capable. She could handle 3 dachshunds. And so I liked this idea of giving her 3 dachshunds who could be a proxy for the staff. They watch her very attentively. They do what she wants without her having to ever punish them or tell them outright. And I also liked the idea that they didn't have names. She had acquired them in the hotel, and the staff had names for them, but June just knows them on a level that doesn't require names. So that was the dachshunds. And so drawing dachshunds every single day. Oh, I should point out, for those of you who are sensitive, I won't spoil the book, but the dachshunds don't die. I feel like there's a lot of readers that want to know that nothing bad happens to the dachshunds.
There's always a fear. When there's a dog in a book, I'm always hetsy.
Especially, I will say there were 3 of them, and I thought, well, you could still have 2 left over.
Oh, no.
No, dachshunds are fine. So when I first started thinking, how do I want to kind of commemorate a countdown to the listeners coming out? I've got 90 days to go. And I told my publisher, I said, I think I'm going to draw a dachshund every day. And they said, that doesn't sound very interesting. I said, it's going to be good. It's going to be good. We're going to draw a dachshund every single day. And so I started drawing. I was a portrait artist before I was an author. And one of the ways I was self-taught, one of the ways that I taught myself was by copying the old masters in my chosen media, which is colored pencil. And I thought, I will do this, only I will also put dachshunds into these pictures. So I set a time limit for myself. They couldn't take any longer than 2 hours. Sweet spot was 90 minutes because it felt like it's already a ridiculous amount of time that I was dedicating to creating dachshunds, which nobody needs. Nobody needs dachshunds. But that was the thing. And it's fun. I actually have them right here because I have this huge stack of the dachshunds.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, see? So that's
So good.
We've got.
Oh, they're so good.
Some of them really just taxed me endlessly. So there's so many of them. But the thing is, as I dove into it, I thought, I feel like the uselessness is a kind of luxury, to tell you the truth. The internet is so full of things which are supposed to be catching your eyes, or they're supposed to be shocking to get you to click, to do an action. And the truth is that when I post these, it says, dachshund number 50 or whatever. I'm drawing a dachshund every single day until the listeners comes out. But there's never a hyperlink to the book. There's never the cover of the book. The book isn't really about dachshunds or art. And so it's obvious that it's just an excuse for me to make something, and I don't need anything from you. I just want you to have a moment where if you're scrolling through the internet and you land there, nothing bad is present in that image. You just get to see someone else's glorious art, a dachshund, and know that the person behind it, because that's key to luxury, right? It's knowing the intention, knowing that the person behind it was someone who was really there being silly with a pencil. And to me, it feels like what a nice way to spend 90 days leading up to a book release.
And I am so excited to see every single dachshund for the next 90 days before this book comes out. Maggie Stiefvater, thank you so much for being here today. The Listeners is out now.
Thank you for having me.
Hello, readers. It's time for another TBR Top Off. We're going to recommend a couple of great books to pick up when you stop in for your copy of The Listeners. I'm Mark at my Barnes & Noble store in Cincinnati, but I'm going to have my book buddy Donald in Detroit kick us off today. Hi, Donald.
Hey, Mark. How are you?
Good.
I am very excited about this episode and talking about the listeners and giving everybody some other books to think about. The Listeners was just a fantastic read, and I think it's going to be a great book club discussion book. But I chose for our TBR selection Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towles. Again, thinking a lot about what I loved about The Listeners, again, is that uniqueness of having the whole story set in one place. And I think the first book that came to my mind when I was reading that was, it's just like when I was reading Gentleman in Moscow. This story about this one man who's pretty much has to live his entire rest of his life in a luxury hotel, which, sounds nicer than it really is. It takes place in 1922. He's a count, and just due to some political issues going on in the story in Russia, he is kind of become a prisoner in this called the Metropole, which is a luxury hotel there. And they trapped him in the attic too, so he's not even like in the best room in the hotel. But what's really great about it is all the different people he meets and the comings and goings, what he can hear and what he's experiencing through conversations, through the different set pieces throughout the story. It's funny. It's got a great glittering cast of secondary characters. It's just one great scene after another. It's very, very cinematic. I know they made a limited series or a miniseries or something like that with Ewan McGregor, which was also excellent. But it really does showcase the uniqueness of this character's life, the struggle that this, aristocratic count has in this luxury hotel. I love using that and saying that because it makes it sound so much better than his experience really is. But Amor Towles' way of describing things, the humor that he uses, the weirdness and quirkiness of the settings and the character, make this a great, great read once you have finished The Listeners. So, Mark, what do you have for us?
Great pick. I love Amor Towles. Everything he touches is truly magical, and Gentleman in Moscow is one of the best. I wanted to recommend The Lonely Hearts Hotel by Heather O'Neill. This is a kind of a melancholy fairy tale type of book that is really boosted by O'Neill's always fantastic prose. It follows two characters who were orphaned in Montreal in the sort of early-ish 1900s. And both of them have this talent and passion for music in their own right. And the way that their sort of initial separation and their burgeoning talents kind of bring them back together as adults just makes for a really wild ride of art and music and love and wonder. There is a circus, a grand stage, lost and found connections, despair and hope, and themes of the way that talent and art can sort of push up against a world that is, at that point in time, nearly beaten down to the ground, and how that can lift up spirits and sort of make a shift in society. But mostly, if I have to be honest, it's a way for more people to read Heather O'Neill. I love her writing. I think the way she plays with language and metaphor is always a treat. And I think her talents just really elevate this book into something very special, and readers are all the better for it. So check out The Lonely Hearts Hotel by Heather O'Neill. But guess what, everybody? That's all we have for today. Thanks so much for tuning in to Poured Over. Please make sure to give us a rating and subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. You can also follow us on our socials at Barnes & Noble. Pretty simple. I'm Mark. You can follow my home store at BN Westchester. Donald, where can we find you?
You can follow me at BN Northville.
All right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Happy reading. Bye.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.